Hello, my name is Jerome. This is my thesis, Becoming Inflammable. What is our relationship to the materials around us and within us? Within these installations, as we walk, breathe, and touch our surroundings, the focal medium of mist is coerced into a new nature, a nature that travels through us, through our breathing. As one enters a space filled with mist, one becomes one with the very environment and installation as a recirculator, and thus is a vital member of the materials processes. Participants become blurred and unified into a communal vapor. This vapor dissipates into the environment and intermixes in a larger ether brew. Sometimes our bodies are not required to breathe and be a circulator of something like mist, but just exist solely as a material in a grander geologic process. Referenced several times by Think Power materialist Jane Bennett, Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky describes us as packaged by materials from the Earth's crust, and that our reproduction and growth build and break down matter on a global scale. Thus, we are solely walking and talking minerals that promote and partake in decay. Our inherent materials, such as our bones and our flesh, are the contributing ingredient to the Earth's growth and prosperity. But every day we still indulge in vanity and knowledge. Vanitas paintings depict that our life is fleeting and death is imminent, and remind us that the vanity we seek pleasure from and the knowledge we obtain is therefore ephemeral. A Vanitas still life painted in 1653 by Dutch painter Peter Claes showcases a skull accompanying a chalice, books, and a violin scattered across the table. The table displays these valuable objects that humans yearn for, but the human skull's presence in the still life asserts itself as the always present sentiment, mortality, that overpowers humans' longing for knowledge and commodities. Similar to Vanitas paintings, T.J. Demos expresses human mortality through human culture being overcome by nature. T.J. Demos, in their analysis of Yellow Patch, a film by Zarina Bimji, believes that the film portrays dust and decay-promoting organisms to represent an image of nature's inevitable victory over culture, showing how the erstwhile grandeur of empire turns inevitably into forgotten ruins. Through many shots of abandoned and dilapidated spaces, archives and records of human instigations are registered as trivial. Buildings erode, cracks expand, and cobwebs fill up the corners. So how can we reconnect with our inevitable destiny within the geologic timeline? How can we recognize our own materiality and our role within the process of a developing and growing Earth? Throughout history, people have been trying to answer these questions through death rituals. Some of these rituals react to a fear of losing one's humanness. For example, hanging coffins. People want to evade the ground to avoid having their body being overtaken by soil and decide to have their dead body be placed upon a cliff. And some of these rituals accept the role of human material in nature. For example, the sky burials in Tibet, where bodies are given back to nature by feeding them to vultures. So through this thesis, by expanding on a history of answering questions of death, I'm proposing a new kind of death ritual, which is achieved through the engagement and construction of a specific kind of material process. This process will construct a framework for an apology and an investment to initiate a communal network. This framework will house the process of becoming anthrametal, a metal that is produced by microbes deep within a cave-like environment that requires an accelerant of iron-rich blood donated by humans, which ends in humans submitting their bodies into an ever-growing geologic network. So I'll separate this thesis into two parts. The first part, becoming anthrametal, will describe how the material process was created and the products it yields. And the second part, representing anthrametal, will showcase how I represented my interpretation of the products of becoming anthrametal. So this material process will take place in Mine de Villa in Lleida, Spain. So during the time of mining the sphalerite in the area, the digging of tunnels will not always be fruitful in terms of finding valuable minerals. Consequently, multiple fragile holes and tunnels are scattered throughout the site. These tunnels are thresholds for the labyrinthian abandoned mining infrastructures that inhabit the subterranean of the Spanish landscape. When viewed in section, these infrastructures resemble a trellis, thus providing a context for growth. Within these abandoned mines, scientists recently discovered a thriving microbial community producing a unique kind of metal. These microbes do particularly well in a dark, wet, and iron-rich environment, which the depths of these abandoned mines provide. These microbes feed on abandoned scrap metal and recycle them by producing a strange branch that flowers iron-rich shell structures. The structures are not pure iron, but contain a fungal presence that embeds itself within the crystalline composition of the metal. We can engage in this biomineralization process, connect with our inherent materiality by donating our iron-rich blood. Our blood is integrated into this process by being atomized into the air. By atomizing our blood into the environment of the microbe community, we can create an even more iron-rich atmosphere to accelerate the process of creating new material. This new material is now not only iron-rich, but rich in our blood, becoming a new hybrid of human blood, iron, and fungus, which I'm calling andrometal. So this process of becoming andrometal engages community through that, similar to Oliver Herring's color spit events, where strangers build a community by blending and covering themselves in material that contains their own bodily fluid of spit mixed with paint. Becoming andrometal builds community between the geologic and the dead through the blending of geologic materials and bodily fluids of blood and bodily solids of bone and flesh. Together through this death ritual, we are fueling a kind of microarchitecture created by the microbes that are organizing the andrometal network. As this process attracts more users, the scale and complexity of the material network will expand. Bodies will eventually fill the mine, and the andrometal system will be overtaken by the surrounding eroding rock. The products of this process will result in a new kind of bioinfill, a bioinfill that sutures the scars created in this abandoned mine site. Within the infill, the microarchitecture of the fungal blood rescue metal hybrid being created and designed by microbes will continue to intertwine itself with the earth beyond the human's contribution to the andrometal process. The blood and bones of the dead will thus be an initial key ingredient that assists the biomineralization process in order to commence a post-Anthropocene material network, so that our materiality will be present within a geologic timeline. To represent this biomineralization process, I began by investigating at a microscopic scale. On the left is a microscopic view of the iron-rich shell structures expanding into space, building upon its own layers that it creates. On the right is a multi-layered collage of mine plans, and through these mine plans, I'm making a representational language that mimics the composition of the expanding iron shell structure. The smaller squares accompanying each image are snapshots of moments that convey fundamental actions of the process, such as suture, fill, stitch, build upon, grow, and rust. These fundamental actions are what guided me into representing architecture created by non-humans, architecture that occupies the post-Anthropocene. After defining these fundamental actions of the process, I began to use various mediums to express them. Expressing, expanding, and connecting material. Expressing the process at different scales and using human and natural features to influence the way of drawing, the way a drawing comes together. So here we have a microscopic scale example of andrometal expanding into the wood fibers of the wood beams that hold the mine together, demonstrating the results of combining different materials, also this drawing here. And executing this demonstration using the composition of platelets and proteins of a blood clot and the microscopic fibers of wood to help dictate how marks are placed on paper or how images are overlaid to generate alternative forms. Moving from the microscopic scale to a handheld scale, demonstrating the process through building objects that have the capacity to change and be manipulated into a new composition or material, like casting twigs that shape a foam object into solid aluminum, like my model here. Similar to adjusting pins in an Ilosarov cast to assist the healing process of complex bone fracture, or bending a bonsai tree's branches with flexible cords and clamps to alter the tree's growth pattern. Each of these objects have some kind of human erected support material or trellis to guide the growth of the material. This process continues to move beyond a handheld scale to occupy more scales as the death ritual of andrometal is fueled by dead bodies and expands. And through this initial investment of human bodies, the process revitalizes a torn landscape and creates a more biodiverse underground geologic network. And through these drawings in various scales, conveying this revitalization through rigorously hatching and overlaying textures to forge notions of new material. The process begins to alter landscapes and ecosystems to build new typologies of blood-infused bioprocesses. In conclusion, these drawings, models, and images are showcasing the potential of our human materiality. And by engaging in an intentional investment of our dead bodies into the process of becoming andrometal, we are guided by microbes into becoming a new crude material and are establishing ourselves into a communal network that will connect us with the geologic timeline. We will exist solely as our crude materiality and as a vital instigator of this grand geologic process.
models sort of represent the reality of the line, or is your abstraction of it?
It's sort of a balance between the abstraction and reality.
Do they go that deep?
Maybe not so vertically deep, but
a couple of things that I find really interesting was, the idea of sort of death, right, in relationship to becoming, and this fact that it really is about life and living in a way, right? So this sort of, the guy, sort of architectural theorist, Marcus Novak, who talks about like this idea of trans architectures, and that things in the future, this is essay probably written in the late 80s, but he talked about how buildings should be grown and not built. And I think that the sort of relationship between the geo and the bio that you're dealing with is quite interesting. I mean, representationally, I think it's stellar. Just the models, drawings, so much to sort of see and look at, and like crop out sort of sections, have that sort of multi-layer contextual relationship that I think is really profound in terms of like looking at something that you're interested in and then sort of exploring it through like a process, but really paying attention to the product, right? And this abstraction of that in terms of the process, I think it reads very strong, especially in terms of technique and the confidence of exploring different techniques and how that allows your interests to be executed in different ways, what this might sort of turn into. But I do like that relationship between that, it might be something that's through ritual, it's about being born, right? In terms, it's never there. It's sort of, if you really look for that line between whatever self and consciousness, where every breath you take, you're expending some of yourself and bringing something in. Like, where is that line, right? And physicists have a very difficult time, like, sort of drawing it at that point, right? This sort of like deals away with it, just lets it, embraces it in a way that I think is quite beautiful.
You read Donna Haraway at all during your thesis?
a little bit.
I feel like you really enjoyed it. Her kind of famous quote is, or one of her books is called "Staying with the Trouble," which is, I'm going to do a gross misinterpretation, but kind of embracing the fact that in a way we are going to die, the Earth is going to die. These are processes that happen over time again. And within that, while we're living, let's try to embrace a bit more of a cohabitation with other things that are also kind of in this process of entropy. And I think it's, I think you have quite a beautiful poetic take on that in that sense, where it's like, let's acknowledge that once we as an ego are gone, we're still contributing and we have possibly actually give back in a way. And I just wonder, with all this work done, and I think that comprehensive take you have on it, like, where do you hope this kind of, what kind of message do you convey to the living, let's say? Because it makes me want to really appreciate and be mindful of the resources I am using at the moment, right? And how, like, in some way, I think to be more aware of that kind of that exchange is happening right now, and it's not so bodily. It's almost removed from my body in a certain sense. I extract resources through eating, driving, and building, but my body doesn't have a direct connection. We will actually return to the Earth. Let's not put ourselves in a middle box and not have that happen. Some challenge that embrace that. Like, I want to be buried in the same body, because I don't want to. That question of the relationship to the living is really the question which is to
say, I agree with the comments that very knowing objects and thought-provoking. But maybe the fundamental reality that you're proposing is that no one sees this. And that for me is the crux of the issue, which is to say, in the context of the thesis, you produced these images that we can engage. But in the context of your kind of purported idealized future, none of this exists in the representation of the thing. Real thing exists, and no one sees it. And that is for me a really, I don't know if I have a problem with it. I'm just like grappling with that fundamental question, because if you think about like the Renaissance paintings, they are about communication, right? They're about a kind of a middle point between life and death, aimed at the living as the viewer. And of those, I think the ones that architects are always most drawn to, and certainly I am, is the Holbein one, the ambassadors, where the skull is distorted and you have to be in a particular position to understand the skull. Otherwise, it just looks like a name right in the painting. And what's so amazing about that painting is, as much as it is about a reminder of death, it reaffirms life in the fact that we have to actually engage it viscerally and through a kind of vision, a position in vision, for us to be able to understand it. So it actually reaffirms life in as much as it talks about that. And that's what you're doing in a way with these like incredibly beautiful objects, because we're kind of all out of here looking at this, right? Anticipating this. But that's where I struggle a little bit, right? And also with the presence of this in underground, it's like even if the four of us that are still alive when this happens aren't going to be able to see it because it's all in the mind, or it may be. So I don't know if there's more thinking that needs to be done about that, or maybe you embrace that and you say that's the reality you're working with. I don't know. But there's also maybe another reference that comes to mind, also in Spain, the Altamira caves in Spain. They kind of one of the oldest cave paintings discovered, almost as older than Lascaux in France. And to preserve it, it's in a very fragile state. So they recreated it to just alongside it, right? And if you go visit it, you see the recreation, not the real thing. And the recreation has a building that surrounds it, and you can actually occupy it outside of the cave as well. So there's, I guess I just refer to that in part because it's underground, but also there's this like relationship between the kind of amorphous cave and the rigid structure of the architecture that surrounds it. And that relationship is what we are meant to understand, right? They embrace the kind of falsehood of the recreation. And that's also super interesting to me about the project, right? Like that model where you're starting to represent both simultaneously. But again, it goes back to this kind of reality that it's a kind of, there's an entropy here. Ultimately, it's only going to look like the thing on the left. And that whole process is undocumented and unknown. So, do you know what I mean? Like, that's what I'm struggling with. It's not, it's not a critique. It's just a question. It's provoking that. And that's sort of what
what is your thought on the cemetery? Like, I feel like that is the space where we go to see that history, see our relatives, kind of see what has died before us. And so is this a cemetery to you? Do you expect the public to come here? Do you expect people to kind of go and understand there's a generation of people sort of been buried here?
Yeah, it's something that I struggle with too, especially studying the sky burials in Tibet, because it's sort of turned into this kind of place for tourism where people not necessarily respect the process that's going on, ritual that's taking place. So that's something that I struggle with having. I wish there was sort of a will of like the individual or of the family to make this voyage out to go through this process, rather than it being just a cemetery. It's more like open to the public for people to come in and walk around just for the sake of walking around. So being a part of the process, I think, is important.
It's like there's a scale figure. Yeah.
What were like things that surprised you during the process of like making these things and having these questions? Were there certain transitions in time when you made something that became clear, or sort of take an alternative route in exploring like this quote unquote process, because it's so, you're exploring your ideas through making.
Yeah.
Right, which is, definitely tip my hat to that. And, but as that process goes, like, where did you find like these pivotal moments where things happen? And then the follow-up sort of part of that question is, what else were you thinking about making? If you had time, or you could do a couple more of something, is there another sort of path you thought, this would be the next step of something like this? Yeah. Based on that sort of finding.
Yeah, well, it helps to constantly scan things, and like being able to use things to like overlay onto other objects, like constantly overlaying objects that I create onto other objects and creating new drawings through that, and then using those drawings that are already like a mix of past objects that's created as sort of fun templates to build new drawings off of. And I think like a guiding medium for me was definitely the rust and erosion idea, because the way that I rusted these objects, each object reacted differently to it. They took the rust in a different way. So really being influenced by this particular rust medium sort of drove me to create more objects to just see how they react to it. Just constantly learning this medium.
Scale wise, if you could do sky's the limit, like how big might something like this be, like in your just imagination as this process unfolds, in a landscape?
Yeah, the image I showed here, I sort of saw it as like expanding to its own sort of new ecosystem, one where humans are really truly invested in it. They're not just living on it, but they're a part of it through that blood expansion. It's like blood bio new processes, Is it like something that organisms can start to benefit from, and maybe not? Could it destroy? I'm not saying it's destroy, but expand on something. Sort of like sprawling out that landscape.
Well, first, just maybe a personal thing that I am remembering your first year studio, and that I was not allowing you to pick up all your paintings, taking up too much wall space, and there wasn't enough room for everyone else. And I guess I just want to say that I am happy you didn't encounter people like me along your journey, but maybe to the boundaries of that you kept taking up walls, just being I think eventually I started putting you on the edge. So one question perhaps, and I think you mentioned ritual, but I think you just mentioned it now so much in your presentation. And so I guess maybe it seems like a mundane question, but would you imagine this only happening in this one isolated location, or would you imagine that this would be a more global phenomenon that's really about kind of rebuilding a material resource?
So the reason I was just tied to this location was this is just where it was discovered, the initial material process that I'm infusing the blood into. I guess it could be recreated in a different atmosphere, given like the necessary elements. And I think that's something that we just have to experiment with. But I think, I don't know, maybe there's potential in artificially creating this material in like a controlled environment.
I guess if the question is if that's not necessarily.
You don't want to donate your blood to this project?
So I was just saying, there's any blood here.
Maybe the other comments about like there's no scale figure anywhere in the context of living, and you talking about it not being a tourist attraction. But I do think that in many death rituals, and to me it's not obvious that I just see them. But many death rituals are same question, maybe this is not for all of the working. But a short time for us. A small. Helping to ritually transition one person's body to become control. But I'm also different. The representation studies are beautiful and fascinating and see that you have lost yourself in fantasy. It's really exciting to be able to those.
Everybody else's compliments on the work. It's incredibly powerful and engaging. And so I want to say that I appreciate the way you, like hearing you present the project this way this time as opposed to like last time. I think it's actually nice to encounter this work in the context of a kind of an argument rather than our constitutional proclamation. I think that the issue of like losing one's subjectivity and becoming a kind of material, like, that's a kind of shocking existential situation, but it is one that it's part of our life. Like the death ritual that you mentioned is a way for kind of coping with that. And I think there are other, discourses, scientific discourses or whatever that kind of attempt to strip away our romanticization of the self or the individual and treat it as a kind of body that, give us a sense of like encountering this kind of categorical problem or the sort of contingency of the categories between like human and material. I think the thing that you're doing that is, let's say, more shocking than that is it's not the loss of subjectivity and difference to becoming a material, which I think you're inheriting from Jane Bennett, but it's the loss of subjectivity and turning that subjectivity into a resource for another subject, right? So to me, that's really powerful because it ratchets this up to a kind of disciplinary concern, right? Now the microbes or the fungus or whatever the heck it is are the architects and the primary subjects for this project. Humans are simply a resource for another subject. And I think that's a much more profound kind of condition. And I think that that puts you as the author, as a kind of quasi-architect in becoming, in a kind of critical position as well, right? So like you're speculating on what it would be like to have a situation where humans are no longer the primary architectural subject. And I like that also because I think it's a way to kind of read the angst in your work, right? Which otherwise I think there are other ways to kind of describe the sort of physical quality of your work. It might be more sort of like simply connected to the sort of subject matter of the material or something like that. But there's a kind of tension and anxiety that I think is really powerful that could be read as a sort of disciplinary anxiety. The representations of something that is like the hallmark of the end of the discipline. So it's a kind of like last screen, or something. I think that maybe one of the reasons I'm thinking about that is I was thinking as looking at this, even though the representations are quite different, of the way that Mark Wigley and others have written about the way that Constant made representations for New Babylon, which were like on the one hand, as a tool for situationist propaganda, but at the same time, he seemed to always like kind of hate the thing that he was proposing, right? And I think that he was able to do that because he was an artist making an architectural proposition without the sort of normal disciplinary hangups of architects, sort of like on the margin. And I think the problem with what I'm talking about is you can never write that way about your own work. You need to find a critic to write about your work to say this is the problem with Jerome. Like it's not sufficiently disciplinary and cultured, or something like that. But I think it's, to me, it's that it's a possible reading because of the way that you set up the proposition, and I think it's a stronger thing than the sort of Jane Bennett thing. You know, to say that simply we lose our subjectivity, become material. It's even crasser to realize that material is something more important. But anyway, very, very cool. Congratulations.
It seemed too like a knowledge, like you could almost give you anything, and using a process through making, you can get at something through that exploration. So you can change a lot of it, to become a cheeseburger, and like something will come out of it, that ends up becoming radically interesting because you've invested yourself in discovering the process, right? And the fact that going through that allows you to make connections that might not otherwise make, that dealing with material and whatnot. And, when you read these articles from ecologists and whatnot, when they do talk about microbes and fungus and the fact that it outnumbers humans in some reason, the fact is there's more of all of that in the world. And to think of it in terms of every time you take a walk in a park, you just realize you just walked across like a little row of ants, right? Yeah. You look back and there's another row, there's another row, and then just for fun, like where are they going, right? And they're like, something like that would be equivalent to you going to, like, I don't know, halfway across the country, and then start sort of shifting away, and they're like, there's this huge community, right, that is thriving, that we have no attention to. And I think that idea of restraint, as if it can exist even though nobody knows about it, and does that even matter, I think is a really profound and interesting idea as well, and whether it's massive cosmic scale or micro, dig down to the center of the earth type of scale, I think is it's an interesting idea to sort of think about, in terms of how it relates to the sort of the process of, and how so I encourage you to keep exploring this. You're on to something and you clearly have a sensibility towards it. And it's important to tune that and find places where that can thrive, Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Great.
But that never starting from zero aspect is exactly
Yeah. Burn up for a second. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.